think we can officially start. And I think the first thing we would like to do is give the floor to our director, Ambassador Brix, and then we will continue with the rest of the talking points. But Ambassador Brix, thank you so much also for joining us, and thank you for being here in this digital setting. Yes, could you please welcome our participants to this event?
Yes, it's a pleasure to welcome you only virtually at the Diplomatic Academy. It's a new initiative of the ClubDA, and I'm very glad that the club is doing this. I think one of the important things is that we have to continue the dialogue in a new form, and I'm glad that the alumni organization has started this initiative. So chapeau to David Lansky. And thank you also to the first speaker in this series, to Anton Pelinka, who is a permanent lecturer, I would say, at the Diplomatic Academy. And the topic that you have chosen is certainly something that will come up more and more the further we go into this Corona crisis, because we started with this Nationaler Schulterschluss, where everything seemed to be clear, and we were concentrating only on the health issues. But now we find out that more and more parts of our not only everyday life, but also of our international life is going to change. Or maybe we are only thinking it's going to change, but this is already something I should not present to you, but our lecturer for this evening. So welcome to Anton Pelinka, and David, I give back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's actually incredible. I just saw 54 participants in this meeting who are all sitting in front of their computers. I am in Vienna. Some of you may be all over the world. Professor Pelinka is in Innsbruck. I just want to welcome you on behalf of the ClubDA. I'm David Lansky. I am the co-president of the Vienna chapter together with Oliver Authried. And we organized this event today. And yeah, basically what we try to do as former DA students is we try to organize the events that we would love an alumni club to organize. We want to see the professors that we miss. We want to discuss the topics that we enjoy so much discussing. And this is our way of doing this in these digital times. Thank you very, very much to Andreas Ehrmann and everyone at the DA who is also assisting us with the organization of this event. And I will now give over the floor to Oliver, who will shortly explain some of our housekeeping rules for this event and who will introduce the topic. And then very swiftly, so to speak, we will dive into medias res and give the rest of the floor to our dearest Professor Pelinka. Oliver, von dir ganz kurz. Danke.
Thank you, David. So it's great to have so many people here, over 60, or no, almost 60 people. I think that's the record for our ClubDA Vienna chapter attendance for the time being, even if it's online, but we have hopefully an international crowd. And let me quickly get over the housekeeping rules to get the boring stuff away and then dive into Anton Pelinka's talk. So if you have questions, and Andreas has already kindly shared it over the group chat, if you have questions you want to address to Professor Pelinka, please do so in written form. Of course, considering the size of the audience, we cannot have all people asking questions at the same time. So we will filter some of the questions and then we will give the floor, in this case, the microphone and the camera to you. And we hope that you will then be able to ask your question personally, directly, and in front of the audience if you're comfortable with that. Otherwise, just let us know. We will read the question out, no problem whatsoever. And this is as much as the housekeeping is concerned. If there's any questions, please, you can use the chat function. I think it works across all platforms wherever you dial in, and either directly to me, to David, or to Andreas, and we will as I said, and we will forward the questions to Professor Pelinka. And well, I think we all know what times we find ourselves in, and we came up with the topic just because we think that we talk about the health, we talk about the economic parts of it, but we also wanted to hear a little bit on what's politically inside it, what will be the consequences, or not the consequences, but what are the ramifications of this crisis and the ongoing, I would call it, well, the loners. Every state does fight for itself at the moment, it seems. And what are the, let's say, what will be the ramifications and consequences going forward? And what are the potential exit strategies for this, also in diplomatic terms and political terms? And I think without much further ado, I give the floor to Professor Pelinka, please.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to give a talk about a topic which I'm not familiar with, at least not with the core question. What is the coronavirus? I don't know what it is, but I accept that it's a dangerous issue. And as a political scientist, I will discuss some aspects, how we can deal politically with this danger. And my focus will be on the question of transnational versus national. As we have maximum 45 minutes beginning with now, I will not talk about 45 minutes, don't be afraid. I will talk in 3 short interventions, I will call it. First, about the long-term phenomenon of border lifting, then contradicted with a second contradicting aspect of the renaissance of the nation state and the existence, a newly accepted existence of borders in different kinds. And at the end, I will come to a kind of final block considering what can be done, especially with respect to the European integration. Can the European Union be part of the solution, or is the European Union the problem in itself? I will stop after any of these 3 blocks and to invite you and please be invited not only to ask questions, but also if you have some points of criticism, feel free to criticize me. I have always thought political science not a matter of dogmatic instruction, but looking for the lesser evil was the best way to explain, always accepting there may be a better way to explain, but also a better way to find solutions. So I will start with my first intervention, which is the long-term phenomenon, which seems to be challenged by the short-term developments, the long-term phenomenon, which I call there are no borders. In many respects, borders don't exist, especially they don't exist for the coronavirus. The coronavirus does not know any borders. And for that reason, it seems to be, in a certain way, very contradicting that we answer to the danger of this virus, this borderless virus, by thinking of establishing borders. Borders cannot be the solution, but it's understandable. As a short-term response to these dangers, borders came into existence. Borders, for instance, like the borders within the Schengen space, have been almost forgotten. I'm talking from Innsbruck for decades now. There was no realization that the Brenner border was such a hot and explosive issue for so many years. But now, as a result to the coronavirus, the Brenner border, border controls, closing the border, has become again a phenomenon. Now, why is my first statement concentrated on the end of borders? We have megatrends, which are global, which cannot be stopped by a specific political systems by a specific national policy. For instance, we have the mega trend of migration. Migration, by the way, which is of course nothing new. Migration has been a phenomenon as long as humanity does exist. We know that we all are coming from East Africa, of course, at least according to the most recent explanation by science. Migration is nothing new. The whole Western Hemisphere, meaning North and South America, is a product of European, African, and Asian migration to both Americas. Migration is nothing new, and migration can maybe controlled, but migration has always be part of the social reality. This is one aspect. Migration can be postponed, migration can be blocked under certain circumstances, but migration is one of the megatrends we have to face. Of course, it's also part of the problem concerning the coronavirus. How can it happen that a virus which maybe have its roots in China comes to Europe and is now a hotspot in northern Italy and in parts of Spain, and is now also a hotspot in New York State. Migration, one of the megatrends, which will not be stopped by reconstructing border controls between member states of the European Union by any border. The second phenomenon is globalization in economic and in cultural terms. We have the phenomenon developed especially after the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Warsaw Pact agreement, the end of at least European centered communist systems, that economic globalization came to the forefront. We have all over what has been called Eastern Europe, which is not so Eastern anymore, banks, insurance companies, other financial investments coming from different parts of Europe. We have, for instance, also Chinese investments. We have Indian investments. This is part of a global phenomenon, which is part of a megatrend. Just one last element I would like to mention is, we have for 100 years now in most parts of the world, the megatrend of social inclusion. 100 years ago, that women were allowed to vote was completely new. In most parts of the world, it has become self-evident. The class borders have not just disappeared, but they are different borders, social borders, than they used to be, going back to maybe in the 19th century when the so-called Manchester capitalism dictated the societies in Europe and other parts of the world. So we have inclusion as one of the megatrends, and inclusion will not go away, meaning the end of social borders, as will not go away migration. For instance, the coronavirus can be even a factor which is strengthening migration. And also, feminization will not go away, meaning the end of social borders, political borders between men and women. So we have an experience over a long-term period that megatrends have succeeded. Globalization in different ways has become part of the reality of the world we live in. And of course, we have to face a challenge. My argument, which I will go into a little bit later in the second and the third part of my presentation, is that new borders may be a short-term solution to deal with these megatrends, but they will not end these megatrends. There will be no return to a fully sovereign nation state. So there will be no return to a national economy completely sovereign in that way that it does not allow global trade, global investments. So we have a challenge to these megatrends, but the megatrends are still there, and we can discuss it. Will the megatrend survive? And my answer will be yes, it will, but the question is under which circumstances will be a heavy price to be paid for this. So I stop here with my first intervention, and as I said before, I would be happy to answer questions and react to some comments, and also react to some criticism.
Okay, so for the late joiners, the house rules that we established before he started his talk was that everybody should post their questions to either David or me or to Andreas, and we will then forward those questions. And in the meantime, I saw that we had some special guest joinings, our former director, Hans Winkler, and maybe he wants to say a few words and maybe react as a first speaker to Professor Pelinka's talk, if he's still here.
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Hello. I have to admit I joined a bit late, but I have really nothing to say because I agree 100% with Professor Pelinka, as I usually do. And although I'm a bit more skeptical that this will be very easy, that the trends that he mentioned will continue as before the crisis. I think the challenges will be more serious than we can think of today. Just think of President Trump limiting immigration now to the United States. The borders within Europe will stay with us a long time. Refugees are completely blocked from our borders, and this will, I think, take much longer than maybe we would like to think. But in the end, I fully agree with Professor Pelinka that those megatrends, globalization, migration, social inclusion, cannot be stopped, and the clock cannot be turned back. I hope. I mean, both Professor Pelinka and I are, of course, of a generation where we would dearly hope that this is the case, because in our generation, when we grew up, all those trends, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, did not exist. And I think my generation is very happy to live in times where we have this social inclusion and where we have these positive effects of globalization. So thank you very much for this event. I'm just happy that life also at the Diplomatic Academy goes on.
And we're happy to have you here. Thank you.
So could I respond briefly to
of course, please.
Ambassador Winkler's remark? First, I am not a 100% optimist. I'm just not a 100% pessimist. The future is open, but my basic argument, I will go into detail more later in my last statement of this afternoon, is that, for instance, integration is based on interests. It is an economic interest, for instance, in the agricultural production in Westphalia, when it comes to asparagus, in Lower Austria, to have workers, agricultural workers, who are able to come without restrictions from Romania, from Poland to work. It's an economic interest to open borders, to stop border limitations. It's also a political interest. Almost nobody can be interested that a new nationalistic explosion could be the result of closing the Brenner border. This is a beautiful Jean Monnet idea, the marriage between idea and interest. This is a difference between the background of the European Union and integration concepts of the past, for instance, starting with Charles Mann and so on. Interests plus idea. You can call it realism plus idealism. This makes me not pessimistic. It's not enough to be an optimist, but it's enough to be not a pessimist when it comes to the question, can this process of integrating societies within the societies and between different states can go on? I think there's a chance to go on even despite the coronavirus.
Any criticism or questions or additional comments that anyone would like to make? Please feel free.
I see Mercedes has a question. I will just I will just turn a microphone on and you can ask the question directly.
Hello, Professor Pelinka. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I can hear you.
Perfect.
Yes.
Hi. So my question would be about Austria's, like specifically Austria's treatment or like acting on the international sphere post-corona. Do you think it will lead to more like cooperation in security policy, or will it lead to more of a retreating on the international sphere, speaking of cooperation?
Well, first, I see the behavior of the Austrian government, of Austria as a society, not so specific. It's not so different from what we can observe in Central Eastern Europe, what we can observe also in Northwestern Europe. It's not so different. There's a tendency to look at the national governments, and the national governments react. If you follow TV news in different European countries, they are dominated by the national governments. The problem is, can the national governments deliver without first transnational cooperation, and secondly, without any kind of transnational governance? There is, in a certain way, an existing national element of transnational governments, for instance, the European Central Bank, which has acted. But what we can observe in Austria, but not only in Austria, is this blame game. The national governments tend to give their guilt, to give responsibility to the European Union, whatever the European Union is. I am a little bit, I think it's a little bit ridiculous. So the head of government criticizes the European Union, and the same head of government is member of the European Union, because member of the decisive body of the European Council. Does he criticize himself when he blames the European Union? So this is, of course, reflecting that in Austria, in other European countries, national identity is still psychologically, mentally stronger than European identity. This is a fact which has to be accepted. But don't forget, there has been progress over the last decades. National identity is still very much a dominant factor when it comes to identity politics, but it has changed. Nobody thinks it's possible anymore that the war between France and Germany can happen anymore. But for 70 years, German army 3 times invaded France. And after 70 years of European integration process, we can say this has become history. It's not a possibility for the future. So we have changes of identity, but still and this is reflected by the dominance of national governments in this present crisis, that the European identity is of secondary importance, and national identity is still the number one phenomenon when it comes to looking at a kind of authority which can help in a certain crisis.
Yeah.
All right, so there is another question. I think Ambassador Briggs had a question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, if I may, because you asked for some criticism, I would ask the first question. What you said about globalization sounds very capitalistic to me, because for many people, the real problem is the unequal distribution of wealth, which globalization may further, which we know that in a lot of countries, there is a more unequal distribution of wealth because of globalization processes. And the second question would be really, when you say the megatrends will go all towards what you mentioned, what about culture? Do you also think that there is a real chance that the cultural identities that exist have a tendency to be more inclusive, more open, more global? Can you give examples for this? Or don't we actually see that they have some sort of long time tradition, which comes up again and again in times of crisis? Now we discussed, for instance, that it's for sure because the Italians like to go to bars or like to be in the open all the time together with others, that the virus was there so strong. These sort of prejudices you hear in other countries. Or others say, no, in Finland, because there people always are in their own homes, there is hardly someone dying because of coronavirus, and so on and so on. Don't you feel that in these sort of situations, these sort of cultural attitudes, which are most of them social, are coming back? And this may also be a mega trend, that whenever there's a crisis, these sort of cultural trends seem to play a bigger role.
Well, first, should I answer immediately or should I wait for?
Maybe let's add another question, even though not entirely related, but I think there's two more questions coming. One from the Embassy of Paraguay, and the other one who apologizes for his sore throat, so he rather have me read the question out to you. And I would summarize it in more like a theme, because one question really relates to moving back to a state where more qualified free movement, meaning more restrictions and more controls, but free movement. And the other one is a little bit good. How does it mean that some national governments actually restrict the free movement of goods? And I know it's a bit all pitched in too much at the moment, but maybe if we can go from question over to the more open questions on the practical things of going back to reopening borders and re-establishing the old system, to put it that way.
Okay. I should answer now. Is it possible?
Yes, please.
Okay,
yes.
First, to Ambassador Briggs' remark concerning globalization, of course, there are winners and losers. I'm not a prophet of globalization. I just think globalization happens. We may like it, some aspects, we may not like some aspects. In economic terms, the big winners of globalization are in Asia. China, and to a less extent India, are the big winners of globalization. Europe is not so much a winner, but it's also not a loser of globalization. But within societies, it's of course a different picture. The big winner, China, and the second big winner, India, have to face an increasing inequality in China and India, because within China and within India, minorities are especially profiting from globalizations, and others are, at least in relative terms, losers. This is a fact, but we don't have to forget this happens. When we look back into what we call industrialization, for instance, in England in the 19th century, there were big losers. For instance, farmers. Farmers moved in all industrialized countries 100 and 200 years ago to the cities because they were losing their expectation to survive in a cultural society. This is nothing new, but this happens now in a global situation. The second aspect concerning culture, of course, there is globalization and localization. But we can also see that we can observe, not at the moment, of course, but maybe in half a year from now and going half a year back, performances in the Metropolitan Opera in New York on TV in most of the countries of the world. So this is globalization, but of course we see also localization. But just from a personal viewpoint, when I grew up in Vienna in the first years of what we call the Second Republic of Austria, all boys were wearing lederhosen, even in Vienna. And I doubt we find much lederhosen today, many lederhosens today, 10 years old boys are wearing in Vienna today. This is also part of a change. I don't say it's good or bad, but it's happening. In a certain way, it's also part of local traditions, cultural local traditions are losing impact. Lederhosens are still popular at specific events, but not in the daily life, not even in Innsbruck in the daily life. The boys don't wear lederhosen in the daily life in Innsbruck today. It's part of a kind of sophisticated local culture when lederhosen are worn. So it's changing, and I don't think just one phenomenon. I think even today, if you go, at the moment you cannot go to a disco, never in the world, I guess. But half a year ago, some visitors of the disco in Sao Paulo knew exactly what has been the fashion in discos in Milan, for instance. So globalization in the popular culture is also a phenomenon. Everybody seems to know who Lady Gaga is. Even I have learned who Lady Gaga is. So it's also part of a globalization of popular culture, of culture. It has negative sides, it has positive sides. My basic argument is only it happens. We can, on the long run, not prevent it. Now, the second question, so why do the governments react differently? The first is national governments have acted because there has been a vacuum. Who was challenged to do something about the virus, about the danger, about the information, what happened in a central Chinese province, what has happened in South Korea, what has started to happen in Lombardy. National governments reacted. They are still the first authority which are challenged. Don't forget, concerning health policy, the European Union has no competence. Why does not have it any competence? Because the national governments have prevented that health policy is becoming a European affair, it's still a national affair. So it's understandable that national governments have reacted decisively. Why have they acted differently? Because I think till today, I guess nobody knows what would be the best way to react. Is it the Swedish way? Is it the Trump way? Is it the way of Governor Cuomo of New York? Is it the way the Austrian government reacts? The reason is this is a completely new situation for any political system. And this is a kind of try and error. And for that reason, it's understandable that the Swedish tradition led to a different way of policies than the Austrian tradition. And the New York state tradition had a different way than, for instance, the Texas tradition include. So, but we also consider we are in a process of learning what to do with a completely new challenge.
Thank you so much, Professor. We have two more questions now. The question is, how should we do it? Because there are also two more segments planned. What do you think? Should we take two more questions?
I think I would prefer the two questions, and then I will keep my statement in the framework of 60 minutes, altogether, of course. I have now 22, 23 minutes left after the questions are raised, so I think it's important to include the audience.
Great. So the next person we would like to ask to come forth, so to speak, is Inga. Inga, you have written a question in the chat. Could you be kind enough to unmute and ask your question, please? Inga. Hello?
Shit. Microphone. So let me quickly get about that. Again, it's a question globalization and economic aspect, and the role, I think that has been covered a little bit, but to what degree is, or what do these international interstate organizations demonstrate the level of cooperation amongst states? What is your assessment of the role that the US and the EU plays in the fight against Corona-19? Level of cooperation, particularly considering that the US is freezing payments to the WHO, as one example. Oh, Mr. Pelinka, Professor Pelinka is...
Okay, yes, maybe I just reading that you should hear me again.
We hear you, yes.
Okay, so between international cooperation, this would be, for instance, ideally, the cooperation between the United States and the European Union. But as the European Union is prevented to act as one actor in this present crisis, it's, of course, cooperation between the United States and different European countries. And in the absence of an actor called the European Union, it's a cooperation between European nation states. What can be done for the future? If my argument is correct, that megatrends happen, that globalization happens, that any kind of virus cannot prevent it from enter any country in the world, the answer is, of course, creating a global authority. And on the long run, it could also include looking for global governance. But at the moment, what we have is the European Union. The European Union should be empowered to act, for instance, concerning also one aspect of ardent and significant interest, to act to allow Romanian and Bulgarian health workers to come to Austria to help the Austrian health system to survive. We are dependent on the openness of borders. At the moment, the European Commission cannot do this because the nation states, the national governments, tend to ignore the European Commission, and the European Commission doesn't have this kind of empowerment to say there must be a way to bring Romanian health workers through a corridor through Hungary to Austria in half a day, which would be technically possible, of course. And of course, also the standards how the coronavirus has been challenged should be Europeanized. It doesn't make sense that, for instance, there is a conflict, a competition, who gets more instruments in fighting the coronavirus within Europe. It should be a European agenda to distribute, for instance, masks, and not part of the agenda of a regional government somewhere in one of the European nation states. So Europeanization is a rational approach to this kind of challenge.
Mm-hmm. Lucas Pertara. Lucas, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
All right, excellent. Thank you for the fascinating talk. I have a few questions. My first one would be, do you expect that in the political debate, globalization will become more criticized, both from the left and the right in the future? Because obviously globalization already was criticized very heavily from both sides in the past. And do you think that this trend will become more strong? That is one question. Also, I would like to understand what you think about how COVID-19 will affect the climate debate, which obviously was dominating the political debate before the current crisis. And then my third question, if I may, is on European solidarity and what you think the state of European solidarity is in the current situation, and how we maybe can overcome the north-south divide that is being felt, I think, particularly in Italy, for instance, and what we as Europeans can do here to overcome this problem. Thank you.
On the short run, I see the strong, unholy alliance between right-wing populism and leftist populism directed against the principle of globalization. But this is like Don Quixote riding against windmills. Globalization happens, and it's especially of interest that the far left and the far right are united, for instance, in thinking globalization is per se negative. Globalization is especially, and I would say, if you have read Karl Marx, any leftist should accept that globalization is a phenomenon which has to be accepted. Marx is about globalization, but some of the populist leftists seem to have never read Marx. So the globalization is a phenomenon which exists, which has to be controlled, but not by an Austrian government or a Japanese government, but by transnational actors and by international agreements, like, for instance, the World Trade Organization is such an international transnational instrument to control globalization. It's interesting that WTO has become also a rhetoric enemy of the present US president, like the WHO. So it's these institutions like the WTO, the WHO could be strengthened, should be strengthened, but they do exist already. And this is progress compared with the time before World War II, before World War I. Concerning solidarity, don't forget, I think my starting point would be the West European democratic welfare state is one of the biggest successes in history. It was developed after 1945. There is a Scandinavian model. There has been even a British model. There's an Austrian model. There's a German model. All together are a success story to combine market economy with social justice. And this also, but was only possible because you had an authority to push through it. As a British welfare state which did exist and to some extent does still exist, was the result of the Labour government after 1945, who pushed through legislature. The Swedish government provided for a legal structure not based on agreement by anyone. And also the Austrian social partnership, which could be seen as the Austrian equivalent to the British and the Swedish way of a welfare state, was of course based on agreement between employers and employees, but it had from the very beginning opposition from the far left. The Communist Party of Austria, which after 1945 played a certain role in Austria, was strongly opposed to social partnership, and the far right. So we need authority to push through decisions. Solidarity based on agreement by everybody could not work. Solidarity based on a broad consensus, but not by a consensus everybody will agree about. If we wait that, and this is of course a basic reason why the European Union has to face an obstacle, because the European Council can in most of the cases not decide by qualified majority. Unanimity is still the rule. And this is the reason why, for instance, the European Union has been unable to deal with the migration phenomenon during the last years, because any member state could veto it. And we need authority, for instance, like the Lisbon Treaty has strengthened it, but not, in my viewpoint, not enough to focus more on qualified majority decision in the Council. This could strengthen solidarity. If we expect that the Netherlands, Germany, and Austria, from the viewpoint of net payers into the EU budget, would agree to pay more from people in Sicily or in Andalusia on the Greek islands, we could wait for every time. I think what we need is structures, a structural reform, because solidarity needs authority based on a broad consensus, but not based on unanimity.
Professor, we have a question on on sanctions on Russia in the nearest future. Do you want to take this question now, or do you want to take it? Does it fit any of your other blocks at a later stage?
I think I'm not a specialist in Russia, but just one aspect. The annexation of the Crimea is some event which Europe cannot accept if Europe is sticking to its principles. This was a violation by rules the Council of Europe has agreed upon with the voice of Russia in the 1990s. And the European Union has to do something about it. If we exclude any kind of military way, of course, what we have is sanctions, even if these sanctions don't work. But if Russia will not be faced with any kind of reaction by the European Union, we have the same situation which existed in 1939 and 38 and 39, when Nazi Germany violated any international rules by, first, don't forget, Austria was invaded, occupied, and then there was a referendum. The Crimea was invaded, annexed, and then there was a referendum. So there's an interesting parallel in the history of the Crimea and the history of Austria in 1938. And then, of course, the second step was Munich, after the democratic powers in Europe have accepted the fait accompli in Austria. I don't argue that there would have been an instrument to prevent it, but just accepting it and not talking about it anymore. Then there came Munich, and then Czechoslovakia was left alone. And only then, in the third attempt, and of course Czechoslovakia, Munich and Prague in March 1939, and then of course the signal wars for the leadership of Nazi Germany, you can go on. And if we know the literature and the sources of 1939, the German leadership of 1939 believes that the decadent democracies will not prevent us from going on with annexing, occupying one country after another. So the signal of some measure, sanctions, even if they don't work, is, in my viewpoint, important. This does not mean that Russia should be isolated. There should be open doors to discuss, to negotiate. But the European Union should not accept a fait accompli in open violence of rules Russia itself has accepted before. I don't think I've made many friends in the Russian government.
Well, we're not the Russian government. So we just have one more question, which there is a concern that it was dropped rather, which is the environmental discussion post-crisis. Do you think we will forget that discussion just as we did right now, or will we have some debate on climate crisis and some debate on climate action after the crisis?
I think it's understandable, but also dangerous that the Corona debate is overshadowing so many explosive issues. For instance, migration. For instance, the situation on the Greek islands. For instance, what's happening in Syria. Also, the environmental crisis. The climate crisis is completely overshadowed by the Corona crisis. The question is, of course, what is happening in the next month? If one possibility, if the coronavirus crisis can be controlled by governments, by some aspects of intergovernmental associations and decisions, then of course the questions will be back to the forefront. The environment question, climate warming, and also migration. If the coronavirus will not be controlled, of course, then any future prediction is just impossible. As a follower of this rational approach, the future is always open, so I cannot predict what scenario will the coronavirus be controlled at the end of 2020 or completely out of control. This is at the moment, the independent variable number one.
Thank you, Professor. Just one more question, maybe directly leading into the second part of your talk, which is a question from Pushkal, who wants to, well, say how you think the EU-China relations, both business-wise and politically, will be affected post-pandemic without any projections or without any philosophical, well, let's say without any future predictions. But basically, maybe if we can just take this question, then move on to the second part.
Sorry, the relations between the EU and
China.
Okay.
Business and politically.
Well, of course, I'm always astonished that in the debate, it's always almost undisputed that China and the United States are the biggest economies in the world. In a certain way, the biggest economy of the world is the European Union. With a single market, with a central bank, with the monetary union. Europe acts, Europe discusses without accepting its potential power. And for that reason, China is a good example that it's not about Austrian-Chinese relations, about Polish-Chinese relations. It's about European-Chinese relations, and European-Chinese relations can be only articulated from the European viewpoint by the European Union. And there is, of course, as a result of the Lisbon Treaty, as an instrument of the European Union, there is already a diplomatic service of the European Union. We should not have the illusion, not even that Germany or France are able to discuss with China on the same level about the future. It's the EU. But what prevents the EU to do this, it's again nationalism, the national interests. This, by the way, this is the main reason why the Brexit happened, because the United Kingdom was unwilling to accept any kind of common foreign and security policy. This was the biggest argument the Brexiteers had from the very beginning. Now, Britain is out, but the EU could make use of the absence of Britain. It's maybe easier when the coronavirus crisis is over to now, without the British present as a blocking force, to discuss, to renew the debate. What does it mean that the European Union is officially designed to have a common foreign and security policy? This is about China. The EU should confront, should negotiate, should also deal with China as one actor.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I think there's still questions coming in, but maybe we should now go to your second part and then take some more questions afterwards, because, or however you prefer. I mean, we can also just.
I think I will go to say my final statement or my final intervention. It is a third intervention because the second has been already mentioned. The possibility of the European Union.
Okay.
The future of the European Union. The European Union exists as a result of a process of learning from history. The beginning was that the French government and the government of the Fourth Republic, of the French Republic, especially Robert Schuman, accepted a lesson from the treaties after World War I. Peace in Europe can only be established not by punish the former aggressor, but to embrace the former aggressor. And this was the beginning of the Schuman plan, of the Jean Monnet strategy, to create a win-win situation within, at the beginning of, within Western Europe, but especially between Germany, Western Germany at the beginning, and France, the European coal and steel community, which was a very important factor with creating the most astonishing economic boom Europe ever had to face, and the most degree of solidarity within Europe also. So by embracing the former enemy, by ending the talk of national us and them, by creating a we, by creating a common interest, by accepting that it's good for the French economy when Germany becomes prosperous, it's good for the German economy when France becomes prosperous again, of course with the help of the United States. The Marshall Plan has also been mentioned, but it is this kind of beginning of a procedure. And Monnet declared this is a process in itself, not coming to an end, not defined by a final situation. The process is the aim. The process is the main reason why we have started this process of integration. And the two main driving forces were, the two main interests were enlargement, starting with the invitation in Rome in 1967, that every European state would welcome to join the European Economic Community, which became then the European Community, which became the European Union. Enlargement, which in a certain way is near its end. I don't see any foreseeable future beyond the Western Balkan states that any other country, not Morocco or not Turkey for the foreseeable future, maybe Ukraine, maybe Moldova, but nobody else. So the first force of bringing forward this momentum of European integration, widening, enlargement, is nearing its logical end. European integration means Europe, and Europe is first and foremost a geographic term. It had nothing to do with Christianity. Don't forget, Christianity had a chance over 2 millennia to create a peaceful, united Europe. In that respect, Christianity just failed. The second driving force is deepening, meaning shifting power from the member states to the European Union. And this has happened in the past. Think of, for instance, the monetary union, shifting important power from the national banks to the European Bank, which dictates in a certain way what the national banks are allowed to do. Also, with respect to the single market, the monetary union and the single market are the most important results of this deepening process. That anyone who is citizen of Portugal has a right and doesn't have to ask permission to live and to work in Austria or Denmark. This has created the background of a potential European identity. And this is also the contradiction we have to face today, that countries like Austria, countries like Hungary are taking away the right of Slovakian citizens, of Romanian citizens to live and to work in Austria. And who is the loser? It's the Austrian healthcare system, for instance, when it comes to the situation in the home for the seniors. So deepening is not near fulfillment like widening is. Widening, in my perspective, has become secondary. I don't think it's secondary for Albania or for North Macedonia, but for the all over the European situation, it's become secondary. Deepening is a big question. And what we can learn from the coronavirus crisis is that deepening is in the interest of everybody. It doesn't make sense that the coronavirus becomes the reason why Slovakian workers are not allowed to come daily to Austria to work in the interest of Austrian senior citizens. Deepening must prevent this this rising interest of national authority again. And of course, there may be, when the coronavirus crisis will become part of the past, it's migration, it does not make sense to have a single market with the freedoms of the single market, not to have a European citizenship and not to have a common European migration policy. This is a big contradiction. The single market must lead, if the single market is not the danger of breaking up, that the next step would be a common European migration policy. It's not up to Italy, it's not up to Greece, it's not up to Spain to decide who should be accepted in Europe, Europe, which has a common market with all the freedoms. This should be the next step. And this would also, in a future crisis, like the present crisis, this would allow the European Union to act as Europe and prevent the understandable situations that national governments have moved into the vacuum, which exists because the European Union is not allowed to act as a European actor. So this is, I think, the lesson which could be learned out of the history of the European integration process. It's not about widening, it's about deepening. It's about shifting power, competences from the nation states to the European Union. And of course, the basic question is, who can do this? Of course, this can only be done by a new European treaty. And a European treaty is based on the condition that every member state agrees, and the agreement has to be ratified by all European parliaments, in many cases by the national electorates. And this is a big, of course, problem we have to face. The question is, of course, one which makes you a pessimist. How can you expect that, for instance, Denmark, which has a rather harsh anti-immigration policy developed over the last years, should accept that migration should not be a Danish right, but a European right, and Denmark is only one voice among others. But don't forget, if we focus only on national interests, how can we explain that the single European market has become possible, that the Schengen Agreement has become possible, even it's in the danger of breaking up at the moment, but everybody, at least at the moment, explains it's the exception of the rule. The rule of the Schengen Agreement is not put in doubt, at least not at the moment. The same is with the rules, the freedoms of the single market. So we have the theory in European integration discourse, the Brinksmanship Theory. Europe can go on with its deepening process only if it's on the brink. If the only alternative to further deepening is ending the European integration as such, going back to 1945. And the basic argument in favor of this Brinksmanship situation will create a common interest in going on, which made the Lisbon Treaty, for instance, possible after some backlashes concerning, for instance, the Treaty of the European Constitution, that there is a common interest that the European Union must exist. And if it can only exist when deepening goes on, then there can be found a consensus that it should go on. This is again the old Jean Monnet strategy idea, Europe as a positive, beautiful idea, but interest. It's against all reasonable economic interests that European is breaking up, is going back to the situation of 1945. And don't forget, and this is my last point, the peace dividend. The European Union, the European integration leading to the European Union has not only created the most prosperous Europe we know from history, the most democratic Europe we know from history, but also the most peaceful Europe we know from history. It has been World War I and World War II, which were the lessons which led to European integration. If we go back to 1945, we are losing the peace dividend. Why should Europeans be more peaceful than, let me say, the Middle East? Because the Europeans are peaceful people? I don't think this is an explanation. We have structures based on interests, which made Europe from the most destructive continent, visible in 1945, to the most peaceful continent. And this, again, is a factor which makes me not pessimistic, but again, the future is open, and I'm a Popperianian. The future is always open, but we have to discuss what is the alternative to European integration. What is the alternative to Europe standing still? And there is, and this is maybe my last picture, that Europe integration is a bicycle rider. It can drive slowly, it can drive around, it can drive fast, but it can never stand still. European Union, according to the Jean Monnet doctrine, is a process. It must go on or it will be lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pelinka. I would really want to give you a round of applause, but that's unfortunately not very feasible through Zoom, even though I will symbolically clap for you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We have a few questions, and actually one is related to one of the things that you've mentioned about the wealth and prosperity in Europe. And I think Ambassador Fassetti from Paraguay, he should probably pose that question directly to you. Ambassador, can you hear us? And can we hear you?
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, perfect.
Oh, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And I would like to see from the point of view of Ambassador Pelinka, how important it is for European countries to maintain a focus on international development and aid despite what they themselves are going through in this moment. Thank you.
I think my answer is very easy and at the same time almost impossible. Because nobody knows, and I guess really nobody knows, what the virus means, which implications it will have in half a year from today. So we have two possible assumptions. One is the virus is getting under control or the virus is not getting under control. If the second scenario becomes reality, I don't want to discuss the future because it's just a disaster. If the first scenario is becoming true, then we can say, again, two lessons can be learned. One lesson is that the European nation states are not able, not strong enough, for instance, to control the megatrends like economic globalization, like the phenomenon of a globalized health problem. They have to come together and strengthen the already existing instrument, the European Union. This is within the first scenario, scenario number one. Scenario number two, within the first scenario, the lesson will not be learned. And we've discussed before the unholy alliance of right-wing and left-wing populism. If this alliance succeeds, and the answer is from the left side linked to anti-capitalism rhetoric, on the right side linked to national sovereignty rhetoric, then there's a danger that we will lose what has been the biggest success of European civilization since 1945, the already existing European Union. This is a danger, and I think it will be in all possible ways a negative outcome. Also in world politics, who after the end of the Cold War is needed to balance. And if we think international politics always in search of a balance, who is able to balance the already existing bipolar conflict between the United States and China? It's the only possible, in the short run. Of course, it cannot exclude India on the long run, for instance. On the short run, it's the European Union. The European Union can be, as in the past, not only a factor for internal peace. The European Union has been a big success story for guaranteeing peace within Europe, but also become a factor of external peace by creating a new balance of power between China and the United States. And this is the situation Henry Kissinger already, I think 40 years ago in his book Diplomacy, has visioned that the future will be a new balance between the United States, China, Russia, India, Japan, but Even 40 years ago, in diplomacy, Kissinger has included Europe, meaning not France, not UK, not Germany, the European Union. This would be in the interest of a global peace structure, a global peace design, which allows that the peace Europe has enjoyed, by and large, at least the Europe within the European Union. Of course, the extremely cruel and conflicts in former Yugoslavia were European wars, but without the European, beyond the borders of the European Union. This recipe of creating peace by structures based on interests and ideas, this can be transformed when the European Union survives the crisis and learns the lesson from the crisis by strengthening its power, by shifting power from the member states to the European level.
I would also dearly hope that the European Union maybe learns one or two lessons from times of dissolidarity, or maybe not enough solidarity. This is at least my sentiment. I think I would like to really thank everyone who also took the time to participate and ask questions, to engage in this short time together where we can discuss these very interesting questions with you. And I would like to kindly ask Ambassador Brix to maybe speak to us as we exit this event. And before I do that, I would like to again, of course, thank everyone at the DA for organizing this with us, for especially Andreas Ehrmann, but of course also everyone else. I would like to thank Oliver as a partner in crime for these things as we are organizing these discussions. And most of all, of course, as we have already done several times, but one cannot do it enough. Thank you so much, Professor Pelinka, for taking your time to speak to us. Ambassador Brix, please.
Thank you for inviting me.
I also add my thanks to Professor Pelinka. Thank you for this voyage. This more than 1 hour was a real voyage. And I have some sort of confidence, because when you started at the beginning, you spoke a lot about why you are skeptic and pessimistic partly. At the end, I got the feeling that you believe in this project and that you feel that this process is possible to continue in spite of, or maybe even because of the corona crisis that we have at the moment. And one thing I hope that everybody is taking away is your idea that a successful project needs to be realistic and idealistic, and that the European project has been built from the very beginning on these two elements. At the moment, I think we share this in Europe, more of these realistic, pessimistic ideas, and I hope that some of these more idealistic ideas can come up again. But I think we couldn't have had a better first move of the ClubDA online than having such a discussion with you on this relevant issue. So thank you again, and I hope we see you soon in real.
Thank you. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss with all of you aspects of a future which is still very open. Thank you.
Last important message, stay up to date with everything that the ClubDA does, with all our events, with all our discussions that we organize. We are looking forward to organizing. I think this was rather a success. So we will think about what we do next, maybe something similar of this sort. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe, stay at home. Wish you all the best, and looking forward to seeing all of you soon.